The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled and reporters lined the back wall, their cameras ready to capture the next legal battle involving Pam Bondi. A former attorney general with a reputation for being both tenacious and brilliant, she had entered private practice but remained a force in the legal world. She stood at the defense table, calm and composed, her golden hair perfectly styled, her tailored suit exuding confidence. But it wasn't her arguments that caused the controversy that morning, it was the small, gleaming cross hanging around her neck. "Ms. Bondi," Judge Matthew Carden said from the bench, adjusting his glasses, "this is a courtroom. Religious symbols are not permitted to be displayed in such a manner. I must ask you to remove your cross immediately." A hush fell over the room. Bondi's expression didn't change, but her fingers instinctively brushed against the pendant. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said evenly, "this cross is a personal expression of my faith, protected under the First Amendment." Carden's face hardened. "This is not a matter of free speech, Ms. Bondi. This is about maintaining the neutrality of the court." Bondi exchanged a glance with her co-counsel, but before she could respond, the judge leaned forward. "If you refuse to comply, I will have no choice but to impose sanctions." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The reporters scribbled furiously. Was this really happening? Was a federal judge penalizing one of the most well-known legal minds in America over a necklace? Pam Bondi had faced plenty of battles in her career, but she knew this one would be different. And she knew exactly how to turn it to her advantage. Pam Bondi didn't flinch. She met Judge Carden's gaze with the steady confidence of someone who had spent years dismantling weak legal arguments. The room seemed to hold its breath as she calmly reached for the cross around her neck, not to remove it, but to hold it up for all to see. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "this courtroom is meant to uphold the Constitution, not violate it. The First Amendment guarantees my right to freely express my religious beliefs, even in a court of law." The judge exhaled sharply. "Ms. Bondi, I am not debating constitutional law with you. I am instructing you to comply with court decorum. Either remove the cross or I will be forced to impose a fine for contempt." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some reporters smirked, anticipating Bondi's defiance. Others exchanged glances, recognizing the significance of the moment. Pam nodded thoughtfully, then reached into her briefcase and pulled out a printed copy of the U.S. Constitution. Slowly, methodically, she flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. "Your Honor," she said, placing the document on the table in front of her. "Before you penalize me, I ask that you clarify something for the record. Are you asserting that a court of law can override constitutional rights?" Judge Carden hesitated. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Bondi continued, "Because if that's the case, I'd love to see the precedent you're relying on. I assume you're familiar with Tinker versus Des Moines, which affirms that personal expressions of faith are protected, even in government-controlled settings." The judge stiffened. He knew exactly where this was going. If he ruled against her, he would be setting himself up for an appeal and a very public legal battle. Bondi leaned forward. Or perhaps West Virginia versus Barnett, where the Supreme Court explicitly stated that the government has no authority to force individuals to abandon their religious or political beliefs in public spaces. The courtroom was silent. The judge's face was unreadable, but the tension was palpable. Pam Bondi wasn't just arguing her right to wear a cross, she was dismantling the very foundation of the judge's ruling before he could even make it official. And she wasn't finished yet. Judge Carden's fingers drummed against his bench, his frustration barely concealed. Pam Bondi had boxed him into a corner, and he knew it. The courtroom was watching, waiting for his next move. He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Ms. Bondi, while you are correct that religious expression is protected under the First Amendment, the court also has the authority to maintain order and decorum. Your cross, as visible as it is, could be seen as a symbol of influence, particularly in a case where neutrality is paramount." Bondi smirked slightly, sensing the shift. "Your Honor, are you implying that my wearing a 1-inch cross is more influential than, say, the 10 Commandments displayed in the Supreme Court itself? Or the fact that we begin these very proceedings with the words, 'God save the United States and this honorable court'?" A murmur rippled through the spectators. Some of the reporters in the back exchanged glances. This wasn't just a legal argument anymore, this was a showdown. Judge Carden exhaled through his nose. "Ms. Bondi, I have already made my ruling. I will now impose a fine of $1,000 for contempt of court." Pam nodded as if she expected this. "Very well, Your Honor. I will gladly pay your fine." The judge gave a curt nod. "Then let's move on, but, Bondi interrupted, her voice sharp with precision. "I will also be filing an immediate appeal along with a formal complaint regarding judicial overreach. And I will be citing this very moment as a textbook example of religious discrimination in the courtroom." The murmurs turned into outright whispers. The judge's face darkened. He had underestimated her. Pam Bondi took a step closer to the bench, her voice unwavering. "And when this makes its way up the chain, because you'll have to answer to a much higher court than this one. And they will ask you the same question I just did. Why do you believe your authority supersedes the Constitution?" A tense silence settled over the room. The judge's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He knew, and everyone else knew, that she had outmaneuvered him. Bondi didn't wait for a response. She turned, picked up her briefcase, and smiled. "I think we're done here, Your Honor." And just like that, she walked out, cross still hanging around her neck, untouchable in both the courtroom and the law. As Pam Bondi stepped out of the courtroom, the media swarmed. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in her direction, and reporters bombarded her with questions. "Ms. Bondi, do you believe this case will go to the Supreme Court? Pam, was this judicial overreach or outright religious discrimination? What's your next move?" She held up a hand, signaling for silence. When the noise died down, she spoke with the same calm authority she had in court. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about every American's right to express their faith freely. The Constitution doesn't take a back seat just because someone in a black robe decides it should." A cheer erupted from a small group of onlookers who had gathered outside, some of them holding signs in support of religious freedom. Inside the courthouse, Judge Carden sat in his chambers, his face pale as he read the legal analysis already circulating online. Constitutional law experts were weighing in, and the consensus was clear: Pam Bondi had a strong case. His decision was being called everything from legally dubious to a blatant violation of the First Amendment. Within hours, social media exploded. #StandWithPam trended nationwide. Legal scholars debated the implications. News networks ran endless commentary on whether Judge Carden had overstepped his bounds. Then came the most unexpected twist. A letter from a federal appellate judge landed on Carden's desk, summoning him for a review of his decision. The message was clear: he had not only lost control of his courtroom, he might have put his own career in jeopardy. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi was already preparing her next move. She knew this battle was far from over. Because if there was one thing she had proven today, it was this: you don't challenge the Constitution and expect to win. Days turned into weeks, and the controversy surrounding Judge Carden's ruling only intensified. Legal analysts dissected his decision, conservative commentators called it an attack on religious freedom, and civil liberties organizations weighed in, many agreeing that Bondi had a legitimate case for appeal. Then the breaking news came. A federal appellate court had officially taken up Bondi's challenge. And in a stunning rebuke, they issued a stay on Judge Carden's fine, stating that his order likely violated settled Supreme Court precedent on religious expression. It was a legal earthquake. Pam Bondi stepped in front of the cameras outside the courthouse once again, this time smiling. Today's ruling reaffirms what we already knew: the First Amendment is not optional. No judge, no politician, no authority figure can strip away our fundamental rights just because they find them inconvenient. Reporters shouted over one another. "Ms. Bondi, do you think Judge Carden should face disciplinary action?" Pam paused, then chose her words carefully. "I don't make those decisions, but I will say this: judicial overreach has consequences. This case is about more than just me. It's about ensuring that no American has to choose between their faith and their profession." Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Judge Carden sat at his desk, staring at the news feed on his computer screen. He knew what was coming. The Judicial Ethics Committee had launched an inquiry into his actions. His reputation was crumbling, his authority under scrutiny. And Pam Bondi? She had not only won the case, she had set a national precedent. Her legal genius had turned an attempted punishment into a courtroom lesson that would be studied for years. The cross still hung around her neck. And now it meant more than ever. Weeks after the appellate court's ruling, the fallout continued to ripple through the legal world. Judge Matthew Carden had been forced to issue a formal retraction of his ruling, citing misinterpretation of constitutional protections. It was a humiliating backtrack, but the damage to his reputation was already done. Pam Bondi, on the other hand, had emerged stronger than ever. She had turned a courtroom penalty into a national debate on religious freedom, exposing judicial overreach for what it was. Her name was now synonymous with constitutional defense, and she was receiving invitations from legal symposiums, television networks, and even lawmakers looking to introduce new legislation protecting religious expression in public institutions. But the most significant moment came when the Supreme Court announced it would review the case. It was the kind of legal battle that could reshape First Amendment law for generations. If Bondi won at the highest level, it would set a national precedent ensuring that no court, school, or government agency could penalize someone for expressing their faith. Standing before a crowd of supporters, she addressed the nation, "This fight was never about me. It was about standing up for something bigger, the rights of every American. And today, we took one step closer to making sure no one, no matter their beliefs, has to hide who they are." The cheers were deafening. Judge Carden, now facing quiet whispers of resignation, watched the scene unfold from his office. He had underestimated her. He had thought he was handing down a simple court order. He had accidentally created a movement. Pam Bondi had not only won a legal fight, she had changed the game. And as she prepared for the battle ahead at the highest court in the land, one thing was clear. The Constitution was still undefeated. The day had finally come. The United States Supreme Court had agreed to hear Bondi versus Carden, a case that now carried monumental implications for religious freedom in America. The eyes of the nation were on Washington, D.C., where Pam Bondi stood outside the grand marble steps of the highest court in the land. Cameras flashed. Supporters gathered, many wearing small crosses in solidarity. Others held signs reading, "First Amendment, non-negotiable, and religious freedom is for everyone." Inside the courtroom, Bondi sat at the counsel's table, her legal team prepared for the fight of their lives. Across from her, Judge Carden's defense attorneys looked tense. They knew the stakes. If the Supreme Court ruled against them, Carden's legacy and judicial overreach nationwide would suffer a crushing blow. The justices filed in, their robes flowing, their expressions unreadable. Chief Justice Roberts spoke first. "We are here today to determine a critical question. Does a judge have the authority to penalize an attorney for religious expression in the courtroom?" Pam Bondi rose to her feet. "Your Honors," she began, her voice strong and steady, "this is not just about a cross. This is about whether the government can force Americans to suppress their faith in order to participate in public life." She walked to the podium, her arguments razor-sharp. This court has long held that personal expressions of faith, whether a cross, a yarmulke, a hijab, are protected under the First Amendment. Judge Carden's ruling was not only unconstitutional, it was a direct attack on the core freedoms this nation was built upon. Justice Thomas leaned forward. "Ms. Bondi, opposing counsel argues that courtrooms must maintain neutrality. How do you respond to the claim that your cross could be seen as an undue influence on jurors or court proceedings?" Bondi smiled slightly as if she had been waiting for this. "Your Honor, if my cross is undue influence, then so is the phrase, 'In God we trust,' engraved in this very courtroom. So is the fact that every session of this court begins with the words, 'God save the United States and this honorable court.'" A murmur spread through the audience. The justices exchanged glances. Bondi continued, relentless. "What my opponent is arguing for is not neutrality, it's forced secularism. And that is not what the Constitution protects." Across the room, Judge Carden's attorneys looked visibly uncomfortable. Their argument was slipping away, and they knew it. Then came the moment that sealed it. Justice Alito spoke. "Ms. Bondi, do you believe Judge Carden's actions set a dangerous precedent?" Bondi didn't hesitate. "If this court allows a judge to penalize an attorney for wearing a cross, what stops the next judge from penalizing a witness for wearing a religious symbol? What stops a government agency from banning personal faith expressions altogether? This is not about maintaining order. This is about control." Silence fell over the room. The justices nodded, exchanging knowing glances. They had heard enough. The decision wouldn't be announced for weeks, but Pam Bondi could already feel it. She had won the argument. And when the ruling finally came, it was a landslide victory. 7-2 in favor of Bondi. The court declared that no judge, no courtroom, and no government entity had the power to strip individuals of their right to religious expression. The ruling sent shockwaves across the country. Bondi versus Carden became a landmark case, one that solidified religious liberty for generations to come. Judge Carden? He resigned in disgrace. Pam Bondi? She walked out of the Supreme Court, head held high, cross still hanging proudly around her neck. And as the cameras flashed, she gave a simple statement: the Constitution won today. And it always will. Pam Bondi's victory in the Supreme Court wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a turning point in American legal history. Bondi versus Carden was now etched into law school textbooks, cited in courts across the country whenever religious freedom was challenged. But the fight wasn't over. In the wake of the ruling, a national debate erupted. Some praised the decision as a resounding defense of constitutional rights, while others decried it as a setback for judicial neutrality. Pam, however, remained unshaken. She was invited to speak before Congress, where lawmakers proposed a Religious Expression Protection Act, aimed at reinforcing the Supreme Court's decision and preventing future judges from imposing similar penalties. Standing before the House Judiciary Committee, she delivered a powerful testimony. The First Amendment does not apply only when it is convenient. It does not fade the moment someone enters a courtroom, a classroom, or a government building. This case was never about me. It was about ensuring that no American is ever forced to choose between their career and their faith. Her words resonated. The bill gained bipartisan support and was fast-tracked through Congress. Meanwhile, Judge Carden, now a disgraced former judge, faded into obscurity. His resignation had been swift, his legal career effectively over. Some reports suggested he had been pressured to step down before impeachment proceedings could begin. As for Pam Bondi, her name was now synonymous with constitutional defense. She received calls from governors, senators, and even former colleagues urging her to consider running for higher office. One night, while sitting in her office, flipping through the latest op-eds and legal analyses about her case, she received an unexpected call. A familiar voice greeted her. "Pam, you ever thought about taking this fight beyond the courtroom?" She smiled. "Depends on what you have in mind." The voice chuckled. "Let's just say, America needs leaders who still believe in the Constitution." Pam Bondi had already won the legal battle. Now she had a decision to make. Would she take the next step? Would she take the fight to Washington? As she glanced down at the cross around her neck, she knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. Pam Bondi sat in a quiet corner of her office, staring at the city skyline beyond the window. The world had changed since that fateful day in Judge Carden's courtroom. What had started as a legal battle over a small cross had evolved into a nationwide movement, one that had reshaped constitutional law and forced the country to re-examine its commitment to religious freedom. The phone on her desk buzzed. Another request for an interview. Another invitation to speak. Another call from a high-profile political figure asking her to consider running for office. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the edge of the cross that had started it all. She had never sought power. She was a lawyer, a defender of the Constitution. But something had changed. People weren't just looking for a legal mind anymore. They were looking for a leader. As she walked to the door, she caught a glimpse of a framed newspaper clipping on the wall. Supreme Court sides with Pam Bondi in historic First Amendment case. She thought back to the courtroom, to the way Judge Carden had tried to strip her of her rights, only to be humiliated by the very Constitution he had sworn to uphold. Now the question remained: what came next? She turned her phone over and stared at the latest message on her screen. "Pam, America needs you. Let's talk." The sender's name? A key political strategist. For the first time, she allowed herself to think about it. She had fought for justice in the courtroom. Maybe it was time to take the fight to Washington. With a deep breath, she picked up the phone and made the call. The battle for freedom was far from over. And Pam Bondi wasn't done fighting yet.